and my life is like a lamp to a world that is searching for the path. We have become the example of Christ, and we are now the light of the world. Can the world see the radiance of Christ in you?
Evangelism does not happen by accident. Discipleship does not happen by accident. If we're going to fulfill our God-given mission as a church, we need to be intentional and reach out and share and introduce people to Jesus Christ.
Africa is an amazing continent with 50% of its population under the age of 18. If we impact the children, we would have impacted the future of the church and the future of our world.
Each one of us has something to bring to the table. Are you willing to release your resources? Surrendering your material goods or your gifts and talents or your time or your heart? What are you going to do?
If we're going to plant the 300 churches, if we're going to reach out to 1 million people through evangelism, if we're going to disciple 100,000 in this nation, and if we are going to have an impact with the poor, with the needy, with children, with all the others who are part of our communities around us, it's not going to happen unless you have committed yourself to the purposes of God and you have been faithful to live by those purposes.
Good afternoon, Nairobi Chapel. I hope you're all doing well. It's a wonderful opportunity to be with you today and to share with you. So I'm looking forward to the chance we have to do that. I'll begin by telling you a little bit about myself. As Pastor B had said, I'm married to Pastor BG, but I'm from the US originally. And when I finished my first degree, I wanted to come and study overseas. So I heard about a university in Nairobi, NEXT. So I came here to study theology. I came in 2008, and I studied theology, and my desire was to learn more about a new culture, about the church in Kenya, how people did theology in a new place, and I've learned so much. I really thank God for all the things I've seen, all that I've learned, and everything that's happened to me over the last few years. When I was a student, that's where I met my wife, Pastor BG. We got married in 2013. I believe we have a picture of that to show you. It was a wonderful day. We really enjoyed it. And it's been an awesome 2 years of marriage. We've really appreciated the time we've had together. So Pastor BG leads the Kinara internship. So she leads the leadership development program we have here at Nairobi Chapel. And she's been with Chapel for quite a few years now. I'm a little more new to the staff team. I joined this year. And before that, as Pastor B said, I was teaching at Carlisle College off Jogo Road. And I really thank God for the opportunity to be here on staff at Chapel and to serve among such a great team. I love my colleagues, and I love you guys. You're an awesome congregation. So it's a great chance to be here. And I'd like to mention a little bit about the ministry that I do. So Pastor B had mentioned that it's called Tyrannus Hall, and it's meant to be a training ministry for any of you. And I think one of the myths that's come up around Tyrannus Hall is that it's a ministry that's only meant for those Christians, as we heard, those super Christians, the people we imagine are around us, the ones who can do their devotions faithfully every day, the ones who don't struggle with the things that we struggle with. But that's not true. And Tyrannus Hall is actually meant for all of us. And it's meant to provide training, it's meant to provide empowering and equipping in different areas such as leadership, such as how to read the Bible, how to study it, how to apply it to our lives, how to manage the resources we have, how to find our purpose and fulfill that. And so these are some of the aspects that we're looking at in Tyrannus Hall. As we prepare for 2016, we have more programs, more classes that will be coming out. We're working on one on social justice that I'm really excited about, that I hope will be coming out in a few months. We have one on missions. We're working on one on lay counseling. So there are a number of different topics that I hope will be of interest to you. If you're interested today and want to get more information, we have a table in the back. I'd encourage you to check it out, sign up, and we can get more information to you. And so that's what I do here at Chapel. So today I'm going to share, and as you know, we're approaching the Christmas season. Christmas is only a few weeks away, isn't it? And how many of us love Christmas? Do you have any who love Christmas here? I love Christmas. It's my favorite time of the year. I love December. I love just the build-up. I love the music, the decorations, and it really speaks to me. It really is a time that I enjoy. And I love celebrating the Christmas story, of reading through the narratives of how Jesus came to earth, how he was born, and what happened. But what I'm going to share today is not what we think of as the Christmas story, but I think it really is still a part of the same story, because it's the end of the life of Jesus. So we're going to look more at the crucifixion today. But I think Christmas is really about that. And I think this, what we're going to look at today, brings out the full meaning of Christmas. It brings out why Jesus came to earth, why he lived, why he died, and why he was risen, why he rose again for us. So that's what we're going to look at today. So it may not seem like the traditional Christmas story that we think of, but I'd encourage us, even as we celebrate the birth of Christ, to continue thinking through the whole story of what he did through his life and what he did even and what he accomplished in his death. And that's what we're going to look at today. So please turn with me to the Gospel of Matthew. That's where we're going to focus today. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27. So it's the first book of the New Testament, and that's where I'm going to read our passage for today. So the Gospel of Matthew, I'm going to read from chapter 27 from verse 41. If you were here a few weeks ago, Pastor Christian brought in a refrain. So when I finish reading the passage for the day, I'm going to say, "This is the word of the Lord." And the response from you is, "Write it on our hearts, we pray." So I'm going to say, "This is the word of the Lord," and you say? Great. So I'll say that when I finish reading the passage. So we're looking at Matthew 27, and I'm going to start reading from verse 41. So this is what it says. "In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. 'He saved others,' they said, 'but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, 'I am the Son of God.' In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. From noon until 3 p.m, darkness came over all the land. About 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, 'Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani,' which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing there heard it, they said, "He's calling Elijah." Immediately, one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. This is the word of the Lord. This passage reminds me of an experience I had a few years ago when I got to visit Ephesus in Turkey. And Ephesus still has some of the same buildings and roads that were there 2,000 years ago. And you can walk on the same stone roads that Paul would have walked on in Acts. And the theater where there's a riot in Acts 19 is still there, the same theater is still there. You can see it today. Even the ministry that I do, Tyrannus Hall, it's named for a building in Ephesus. It's named for a lecture hall where Paul spoke with new believers for 2 years after he was no longer welcome at the synagogue. So as we were going through Ephesus, we had a tour, we had a guide, and the guide was telling us about some of the buildings. And you know the Romans had very advanced plumbing. And some of the nice houses in Ephesus had running water, even 2,000 years ago. And one of the things we saw was a Roman toilet. And so they had these, public toilets that they would use. And the way it was set up, it was a stone bench. And the stone bench had holes cut out that you would use. And the guide said that they had a jar. And then the jar would have a stick with a sponge on it. And they would dip it into this sour wine or vinegar. And they would use that to clean themselves. So he mentioned, and he said, when Jesus died, and when he was at the cross, the sponge they gave him, that's the sponge that they offered him. That's a terrible thing to do, isn't it? That's a terrible insult that they were making to Jesus. And it highlights what an awful time he had. It highlights the humiliation of being killed on a cross, the torture, the agony that he must have felt as he was there on the cross. And as he's there, hung up, and as he's not dead yet, but he's still saying things, there's something he says that's very important. And I want to focus on that today. And he asks a question. And he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that's the question I want us to look at. And for a long time, when I read this story, I didn't understand it. And I didn't understand, why would Jesus be forsaken then? Why would God forsake Jesus at his most crucial time of need? Why would he abandon him right when he's been abandoned by his disciples? He's been left behind by his friends. He's, had a travesty of justice, that should have never brought him to the cross because he was innocent. Why, in that moment, would God also abandon Jesus? It doesn't seem fair to me. It doesn't seem fair because Jesus was being faithful. Jesus was doing what he came to earth to do. And if you think of the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus was praying there, he prayed that God would deliver him from the cross. And he said, if there's any way that you could take this cup from me, please take it away. Because I don't want to go through this. I don't want to be killed on the cross. So he prayed. He was in agony. It says he prayed as though he was sweating, as though he was sweating blood. But he said, not my will, but your will be done. Because he was faithful. And he was willing to go through with it, even though he didn't want to. So if Jesus was being faithful to what was determined before the foundations of the earth, the plan of salvation, why would he be abandoned now? I want to read from a song. Some of you may know the song, How Deep the Father's Love for Me. How Deep the Father's Love for Us. The second verse of this song talks about this, and it says this. This song says, how great the pain of searing loss. The Father turns his face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. And I think this song captures the way we look at this experience in the life of Jesus. Because the way the song reads, it sounds as though God is looking down at what's happening to Jesus, and he's saying, this I can't watch. The pain, the torture, it's too much. I can't watch my son go through this. I need to turn my face away. And I think that's how many of us read this passage. But I want to present a different perspective today. And I don't believe this is actually what happened. And I think there's another way to look at it. And there are some clues that I want us to look at in the text as to what was actually happening. One of the clues we're going to look at is the fact that Jesus was quoting from somewhere. This wasn't original with him. He's actually quoting from another passage. But before I tell you where he was quoting, I want to say something about an oral culture, because I think it helps us understand this quotation. An oral culture is a culture where the majority of people are not able to read or to write. And that was the culture of Jesus' time. So most Jews, when they would worship, they'd go to the synagogue, they would hear the scriptures being read to them. And that's the only time for many of them that they would hear the scriptures. They didn't have a Bible at home like many of us do. So they weren't able to go home and read it, but they were able to go, and the priest or the scribe or whoever was leading would read the Psalms, they would read the passage of the day, they would hear it, they would worship, they would go home. And when you live in an oral culture, the only way that you keep things, the best way to keep things is to memorize it. So if I meet you and you give me your phone number, I'm not going to memorize it. I'm going to enter it in my phone so that I don't have to ever think about it again. And when I call you, it's stored there, and I have no idea what it is. If my phone's gone, my numbers are gone too. But in an oral culture, you memorize the number. In an oral culture, you memorize the address. You memorize the story. And if you think of your grandparents, I imagine many of our grandparents, they grew up in more of an oral culture. And so they know their folk stories inside and out, isn't it? They know how to tell a story. They know their proverbs. They know their traditions. They know their wise sayings. And they're not going to forget them because they've been passed on. They've been repeated so many times that it's written in their memory in a way that they can't forget. And the Jews were more like this. Now, in many cultures, even today, memorization is something that's well practiced. Many Muslims have memorized the entire Quran from beginning to end. The Quran is long, yeah? But many Muslims have memorized all of it from beginning to end. You can look up online all those who have done it. And many Jewish school children, when they go to school, they would also memorize the Old Testament. They would memorize the law, the Torah. They would memorize the Psalms. And so if you mentioned a psalm, they would know the rest of the psalm. They would be able to recite it from memory easily. Any good Jew would know the Psalms. And Jesus was quoting from a psalm. He was quoting from Psalm 22. So if you can turn with me, I'm going to read that psalm. I'm going to read that psalm for us. So Psalm 22 is a psalm that the Jews would know. It's actually known today as a messianic psalm. Something else I've noticed about an oral culture here, I've noticed when I hang out with my wife's friends, that they're very happy to share stories for hours and hours and hours. Like when they go camping with BG and with her friends, they can easily share stories for 5 hours. And for me, as an American, I often get a little impatient. And I come from a very active doing culture. So I come from a culture where we play games, we do stuff. So after an hour or so, I'll ask, does anyone want to play a game or go for a hike or do something? But for them, for BG and her friends, they're like, no, we're fine. We're happy just, telling these stories and sharing what we've been doing the last week or so. And I'm like, okay. But for me, when I'm with my friends, we would play games. And so I think Kenya, in some ways, I've noticed it's a little closer to the oral culture of the Jews. And so I think there's more of that storytelling culture that's been maintained. I've noticed that since I've been here. And I'm getting to appreciate it more. It takes some time, but I'm appreciating it more. But I want us to now read Psalm 22. And so I'm going to read that for us. I'm going to begin with verse 1. I'm going to read verses 1 and 2. I'm going to jump to verses 6 and 8, and then I'm going to finish with verses 22 through 26. So that's what I'm going to read for us. So please read along with me in Psalm 22. It begins like this. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. But I am a worm and not a man. This is verse 6 now. I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. Moving to verse 22. I will declare your name to my people. In the assembly, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, honor him. Revere him, all you descendants of Israel. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. From you comes the theme of my praise in the great assembly. Before those who fear you, I will fulfill my vows. The poor will eat and be satisfied. Those who seek the Lord will praise him. May your hearts live forever. This is the word of the Lord. So Jesus knew that any faithful Jew, when he quoted the beginning of that psalm, would think of the rest of the psalm. And it's a long psalm. I'd encourage you to read all of it. It's a great psalm. And it's written from the perspective of David. So David went through a lot of hard times in his life. David was anointed to be king. He had to wait about 20 years before that came true. He was forsaken in the desert. He had to run around, and he was chased by the king, who he served faithfully. He had a rough life. And so when David was writing this, he was writing this from a perspective of having known those feelings of abandonment, those feelings of being forsaken. But as you go through the psalm, you recognize that he's saying that God hadn't really abandoned him. That even though it looked that way, that God was actually there. He never turned his face away. Let me read verse 24 once more. It says, he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. And that's what God did to David. That's what God did to Jesus. That's what God does for us today. And so when Jesus is quoting this psalm, he has the whole psalm in mind. And he knows how it ends. He knows how it begins. He also knows how it ends. So what does this mean for us today? Well, what does this psalm that was written so long ago have to do with our lives today? Now, I know we're approaching the Christmas season. For some of us, that can be a really difficult time. Some of us, it's a great time. Others, it brings back really painful memories. Maybe you've lost someone around this time, and this is always a reminder. Maybe your family is smaller than it used to be, and every time you meet, it brings back the thoughts of what's happened in the past, the people you've lost, maybe the arguments that have come in, the way you've drifted apart. Maybe some of us look at the families around us. We look at the holiday celebrations we see on television or other places, and we think, wow, that really doesn't match what my family does. I feel like my family never lives up to the perfect families that I see all around me. And maybe this season is a reminder of that absence in our life, about that lack that we suffer. Maybe some of us today are coming into this service feeling abandoned by God. Maybe you feel forsaken. Maybe you've been going through a hard time, you've had a rough week, and you don't see God anywhere in your situation. So this message is for you. This message is intended to be a message of comfort and encouragement to you. So there are 3 points I want us to look at as we think through this passage and what it means for us. The first point is the importance of our emotions. Because you may ask, it's like, okay, if Jesus knew that God was there, if Jesus knew how the psalm ended, why did he quote just the beginning? Why did he say, my God, why have you forsaken me? And the answer to that is, I believe the answer to that is that Jesus was fully human. He was fully God, but he was also fully 100% human. And he went through every emotion that we do. The book of Hebrews tells us we don't have some removed high priest who's up there looking down at us and saying, wow, those poor people are really suffering. That must be terrible. But he came to us and knows what it feels like. He knows what it's like to lose someone. He knows what it's like to suffer, to be angry, to be upset. So Jesus went through all those emotions without sinning. What's the shortest verse in the Bible? Who can tell me? Jesus wept. Yeah? Jesus wept. Do you remember what was happening? Why did Jesus weep? It's when Lazarus died, isn't it? It's when Lazarus had passed away. They came late. He'd already been buried. What did Jesus do right after he wept? What did he do with Lazarus? He rose him back from the dead. So it seems to me, if I were going to visit my friend, and I knew they had passed away, and I knew I was going to raise them from the dead as soon as I get there, I think for me, it might affect my emotions. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's a bit sad, but I know we're going to see him again in like 10 minutes. Yeah? It's not, you don't need to get all worked up about it. I'm going to solve it. But Jesus still wept, didn't he? He still cried. he still had that emotional response because it was his friend. It was his friend who had died, and he felt that pain. The same way you feel the pain of someone you've lost. Whether you see them again, in a long time, whether we're reunited, however that happens, we know that feeling of loss. We know that feeling of abandonment when it feels like someone has gone from us. And Jesus felt that too. So our emotions are important. And the only way we grow in any relationship with God, with our friends, with our family, is through sharing our emotions openly. I want to give an example from a dating relationship about how a relationship can progress in terms of emotions. So let's imagine you've just met someone, you've gone out once, and she invites you over for dinner. So you go to her house, you go in, she's prepared this nice dinner for you, and she's made liver. Now let's just imagine, let's say you hate liver, yeah? You despise it. Liver is your least favorite food. But you come in, and you're like, wow, this is great, you've cooked dinner for me, this looks awesome, you eat it, you're like, that was wonderful, thank you so much, I hope we can see each other next weekend, and then you leave. Now, let's imagine you continue your relationship 6 months down the road. Let's say you're doing dinner plans, you're like, why don't we do beef stew instead? Is that okay? Why don't we try something else? She's like, okay, that's fine. So you do that. And then, let's say 2 years down the road, you're married, and you walk into the kitchen one day, and you smell her cooking liver. And you're like, that is disgusting. I'm not touching that. Unless you make something else, I'm going to order pizza, but I'm not eating any of that. Yeah, because that's not my thing. I'm not eating that. So why is it different? What's changed? So in the beginning, you're just tiptoeing around each other. You're not really opening, you're not opening up. You're not sharing how you really feel completely. Because, you want to get to know each other first. You don't want to offend someone too soon. You want to get there slowly. And so you're careful with how you present yourself. And then, as your relationship progresses, you begin to be more tactful. You begin to bring up the things that bother you. So that's the second phase. And the third phase is full and complete honesty, where you can share exactly how you feel. And you're very open with what's going on. So where are you in your relationship with God? How many of us are still at the first phase? We're still tiptoeing around the issues we have with God. There's unresolved things that have happened maybe 5, 10 years ago, and you've never brought it up with God. You've held that anger, that resentment ever since, and you've never dealt with it. The only way you can grow in your relationship with God is by voicing out those feelings of frustration, those feelings of anger, those feelings of abandonment, and so on. That's the only way you can come to a place of honesty with God. It's the only way you can grow in that relationship. If you're too afraid to voice it out, you'll never get to that place of openness. So I'd encourage you, if there are things that you've always felt afraid to tell God, you can tell Him. If you're angry with God and you don't see why He allowed something to happen, you can tell God that. You can be angry with God. You can even be bitter. You don't want to stay bitter. But God recognizes that those emotions are real. Those emotions are important. And if you don't address it, if you don't voice it out, you'll never deal with them. The same as with a relationship. So you can be honest with God. You can voice out what's happening. If you look at the Psalms, you look at Job, you see a lot of honesty in the way they speak to God. Some of it seems harsh. I read some of the Psalms and I'm like, wow, that seems too much. But God can handle it. God can handle even your accusations. He can handle that anger that you can direct at Him. So you can tell God how you feel. It's okay. And that's the only way you'll move deeper in your relationship. But even though our emotions are important, that brings me to my second point, that they're unreliable. That our emotions cannot be trusted. They cannot be relied on. And they can't be the only basis of how we make decisions, of how we relate to God and what we do. So they're important, yes, but they're unreliable. And I want to give an example from the children of Israel. I want to give an example. It's something I call the crying in the desert syndrome. Something that they did. So let's think of the children of Israel. When they were released from Egypt, what happened? So God came in. And God did these miracles to set them free, these signs and wonders, these plagues. How many did he do? You know that God could have come in, he could have done one thing and set them free. But he didn't choose to do that. He didn't do 1, he didn't do 3, he didn't do 5. He didn't even do 8. He did 10 miracles before they were set free. 10 demonstrations of power over the Egyptians and over the Egyptian gods. So after he did that, he did those 10 plagues, and then Pharaoh finally let them go. What happened? They left, they came up to the Red Sea. When they're about to cross the Red Sea, they realized they were stuck and there's an army behind them. There's an army coming to recapture them. So it looks pretty bad. They're unarmed. They don't have their own army. They're a lot of women and children. They can only move slowly. So God delivers them in a miraculous way. He parts the sea. They walk through on dry ground. And he destroys the army behind them. He removes it completely. So it's no longer there to threaten them. So when the Israelites made it through, they passed the Red Sea. They're now in the desert. So they're going through. When they come across new challenges, they need water. God provides water out of a rock, which does not normally provide water. He provides food miraculously from heaven. He provides manna that comes down every day for them. When they get tired of manna, he provides quail, he provides meat for them to eat. So every step of the way, God is faithful and God provided for them. But how did they respond? When they come to a new challenge, what do they do? Do they say, I remember a few weeks ago when God delivered us and he did this crazy miracle and now he's probably going to do the same thing. And I remember the week before that, God's done so much for us, so we should trust in him. Did they do that? They didn't, did they? Every time they came to a new challenge, every time they came upon a new obstacle to be overcome, they gave up. And they said, God has brought us here to die. God has abandoned us. God has left us out here. We're going to run out of water. We're going to die of heat stroke. We're going to die of starvation. This is it. He brought us from Egypt, but I wish we were back there because now we're going to die. That seems a ridiculous response, doesn't it? When you've seen so many demonstrations of God's power, how can you continue to have so little faith? How can you have so much doubt after you've seen so much? But I know in my life, we do this. I do the same thing. And when I come across a new challenge, I often give up. It's easy to look at the Israelites and say, they're being silly. They're being foolish. They should know better. If I were there, I would have done better. But from my life, I know I do the same thing. It seems to start from an early age. I think we have a picture here of my daughter, McKenna. And I don't know if I mentioned earlier, we had a new daughter a few weeks ago. And we're very excited. And this is her, and she's in a crisis, yeah? So she's woken up, she hasn't been fed, and for her, her world is ending. She feels that this is it. If she doesn't get fed now, she's not going to make it. And she gets so upset. You can see her there. She's screaming, she's crying. She gets so upset. And it seems to be a very early thing. So whenever we have these challenges, our first response is to go into crisis mode. It's to forget what God's done. And it's to think that this is it. If I don't scream and make a scene, it's all going to fall apart. And that's what she does. But we haven't forgotten her, have we? We're right there. We're taking care of her. We'll give her all the food she needs. We'll clean her. We'll do all that we need to take care of her. And so something I want you to remember as you leave this service. Remember that the feeling of being forsaken is genuine, but the reality of being forsaken is not. Let me say that again. The feeling of being forsaken is genuine, but the reality of being forsaken is not. Tell that to your neighbor. Tell your neighbor that the feeling of being forsaken is genuine. And so we need to recognize that that feeling is there. We need to recognize that we can feel abandoned, but it's not true because God is always faithful to us. And so I remember when I was in college, and I was dating someone. I thought we were going to get married. When that relationship ended, it was really a crisis for me. And I felt that at that time God had abandoned me. I didn't see any hope there. And I'd put so much effort into that. I had so much riding in that relationship, and I really wanted to get married very, very deeply. And I was so disappointed. I was just crushed. And it took me years to work through that. It took me a long time to see any hope in that situation, to see anything good come out of that. It took a really long time. And in that moment, it felt like God wasn't there. It felt like God had left me behind, that God had moved on to something else, but he wasn't taking care of me. Are there any of us who have also felt that way? Are there any of us that have felt that God has left you behind, that he's moved on to something else, but he's not dealing with your situation? He's not helping you in your time of need? Think about a time when you felt that way, and think about how you responded to that. What did you do? How did you deal with that situation? What did God teach you through that? And I think all of us have felt that way to some degree or another at some point. And all of us can feel abandoned. But the reality is that God is still there. And that brings me to my third point. My third point is the reliability of God. The reliability of God. So we've seen the importance of our emotions. We have to share how we're feeling. It's important to be honest and open with how we feel, especially with God. The unreliability of our emotions. We don't want to get stuck in the crying in the desert syndrome. We don't want to get lost so that our emotions are the end. Yeah? And that's our stopping point. We want to work past our emotions and reach the point where we trust God. We reach the point that we believe that God is reliable, that God is faithful, and that his promises are true. That God can bring good out of terrible situations. That when Joseph was taken into slavery in the Old Testament, God used that to bring good out of it. He used it to provide food for thousands of people. When Jesus was killed, that was a wrong thing to do. It was a breakdown of justice. He should never have been killed. He should never have been betrayed. But God used that to accomplish our salvation. He used that to redeem all of us who are here. He used that to bring together this church. If that hadn't happened, none of us would be here. We'd have no reason to worship today. We'd have no reason to do plug-in or to do anything that we do as Christians. And that's the foundation of all that we do. It's the foundation of how we love and serve God. So God has given us so many assurances in his word. I want to read a few of them for us. I'm going to read briefly. You don't have to turn here, but I'm going to read briefly in Acts chapter 2. And Peter is preaching about the death and resurrection of Christ. He says this in Acts chapter 2. He says, "Brothers, I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here to this day. But he was a prophet and knew that God had promised him on oath that he would place one of his descendants on his throne. Seeing what was ahead, he spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to the grave, nor did his body see decay. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of the fact. Exalted to the right hand of God, he has received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit and has poured out what you now see and hear." So Peter was talking about the very passage we read, wasn't he? He was saying David knew what was going to happen. David was prophesying of an event that was going to come far in the future. And he knew that even though it would seem he was abandoned, he wasn't. That God was faithful and God was there the whole time. There are many promises we have in Scripture of God's faithfulness to us. In the Psalms, in Psalm 27:10, it says, "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." And I know there may be some of us here who have been forsaken by our family. Maybe you didn't have a father when you grew up. Maybe you don't get along with your mother. Maybe you have issues in your family. Maybe they've disowned you for whatever reason. But even if that happens, and I pray that it doesn't, even if that happens, God has promised us that he will still receive us, that he is still there for us. He will adopt us as his children, and he will not leave us to be left alone. In Psalm 37, 27 to 28, it says, "Turn from evil and do good. Then you will dwell in the land forever. For the Lord loves the just and will not forsake his faithful ones." In Psalm 94:14, it says, "For the Lord will not reject his people. He will never forsake his inheritance." In Hebrews 13:5, it says, "Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, 'Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you.'" And that's an airtight promise. That's a promise you can rely on. It's a promise you can take to the bank. It's a promise that will never fail because God doesn't fail. We have the testimonies all through history. We have the testimonies in my life, the testimonies in your lives. And God's continuing faithfulness has been so well documented. But it's still, even knowing all that, it's still easy in that moment to feel that we're being forsaken. It's still easy to feel that way. So recognize that the feeling is there, but the reality is that you are not. The reality is that God is still with you. I want to quote again from the song I looked at earlier, the next verse, "How Deep the Father's Love for Us." It says this. It says, "Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer. But this I know with all my heart, his wounds have paid my ransom." And that's the assurance we have today, that God has taken care of the problem of death. He's taken care of the problem of sin. And he's given us new life in him that we can rely on. So we've seen three things today. We've seen the importance of our emotions. We've seen the unreliability of our emotions. And we've seen the reliability of God. That's what we've looked at today. We've seen that the feeling of being forsaken is genuine, but the reality of being forsaken is not. And as you leave today, as I prepare to wrap up this service, as you leave today, I pray that you would leave with this assurance. You would leave with this encouragement that God is always there for you. No matter how dark things may seem, no matter how difficult it may be to pay the rent, no matter how much your business is struggling, no matter how much your family is falling apart, no matter how dark things seem to be in the country, no matter how dark things seem to be with the attacks we see around us, the rise of terrorism and everything else that's happening, the corruption that we see that doesn't seem to be getting better, all the challenges we face, no matter what happens, no matter what comes, God's assurance is that he will always be there for us, and he will never forsake you. So I don't know exactly what you're going through today. I don't know the challenges that you're facing, but God does. And even though it may not seem that he's doing much, he's still there, and he'll still take you through. I want to give an opportunity in just a few minutes to pray for you. And I'm going to ask our prayer counselors to begin to make their way forward to the front. And if anyone is here, and if anyone is feeling forsaken right now, I want to pray to encourage you. And I want to, when we pray up here, we're able to pray individually, we're able to spend more time. And I want to provide that opportunity for anyone who would like that, for anyone who wants some encouragement before they go into the week, for anyone who wants to have that renewal before they leave this place. And maybe there's some of us who are here and you're feeling forsaken by God, and the reality is that you've never accepted God. That, you come to church, but maybe you've never actually committed your life to him. Maybe you've never given up control, and you've never allowed him to take charge, to be the Lord and ruler over your life. And if that's where you are, I'd love to pray with you today. And I'd love to pray that if you want to accept Christ, if you want to come to the point where you say, those promises that you mentioned, I want those promises for my life. I want to embrace that so that I know God will take care of me, that I know as I go through this week that God is with me. If that's something that you'd like, if you want to accept Christ today, we can pray with you to do that. And I'd ask you to come forward to do that. So please rise to your feet. I'm going to close us in prayer. But I want us to purpose that as we leave this place, as we go out back into our daily lives, as we continue with the rest of our week, that you would decide now that when the times of forsakenness come, when the times of challenge, the times of feeling abandoned come, that you would remember the promises and that you wouldn't give up hope, that you'd tell God how you feel, you'd pray with Him, you'd even share with your friends, but that you'd remember the promises He shared with you, and you'd remember what He's done for you in the past and the assurance He's given you of where He wants to take you in the future. Decide that now, because in that moment, you may not have the strength to do it. But if you decide now, it's easier when those times come. And the times will come. We'll all face times of challenges in the weeks and months ahead. As you prepare for the new year, good things will come, challenging times will also come. So let's pray together. Dear Lord, I thank you for the service we've had here today. I thank you for the time to worship you, the time to give before you, and the time to look at your word and to see the assurance you've given to us through your servant David and through Jesus and what he shared on the cross. I pray that we wouldn't just remember the beginning of Psalm 22, but we'd remember the whole thing. We'd remember the end. And that we live our lives in the realization of the vindication that you will bring eventually. We live our lives in the realization of the assurance and the promise that you've given us, that no matter how difficult things are, that you are still with us, that you love us, and that you will continue to walk with us and encourage us and strengthen us. I thank you for your favor and your blessings on us today. I thank you for all those who are here, and I don't take it for granted, oh God, the opportunity to worship you. I don't think any of us are here by accident, but I believe you brought us here for a purpose. You brought us here for a significant reason. And I pray that you would fill us with your Spirit. You'd give us the joy of your salvation, and that you'd encourage us as we leave this place. I pray that all that we do here would be honoring to you and to be to the glory of your name. I pray that your kingdom would continue to grow in our lives. It would grow in our neighborhoods. It would grow in our country. That your will would be done, oh God, and not ours. So I thank you again, and I pray you continue to help us remember that you are always with us. In Jesus' name I do pray. Amen. So please, if you'd like to pray, come forward. For the rest of you, go in peace to love and serve the Lord.